Hurricanes are becoming more intense, dumping massive amounts of rain. What this means for cities away from the coast and chasing down extreme weather. Warren Faidley's desire to know more. This is NTWC Live.
And welcome to NTWC Live. It is going to be an exciting day today. We've got a lot of great folks with us here. Greg Carbin's just in. We have Warren Faidley here today, and of course, Hal Needham and Bill Reed. And we'd like to say a big thank you to all our sponsors, USAA. They make this thing possible. They've helped us with all the conference stuff. South Padre Island Convention and Tourist Bureau, the Weather Company, the Weather Boy. We've had some other folks that have also helped us out as well. So we really appreciate them for really getting with us and making things possible. All of this, the podcast, and of course, the conference. And let's go over to Hal Needham first today. Hal, we want to talk to you and see what's happening with you, and of course, introducing our guests.
Yeah, good morning from Galveston. Boy, the heat wave continues here along the Gulf Coast. Beautiful weather, though, today, hot and humid, as you might expect. I'm really excited to introduce our first guest today. I met him at the National Tropical Weather Conference in South Padre this last April. Warren Faidley was the first person to pursue severe weather and natural disasters in full-time capacity as a journalist, consultant, cinematographer, and photographer. He has recently been labeled as America's top storm chaser by multiple media outlets. Warren has likely experienced more assorted severe weather and natural disaster events than any other individual on the planet. Warren, thank you so much for joining us on NTWC Live.
Thank you for having me.
Warren, I mean, you've covered so much stuff. I mean, I was curious hearing your story and your background. How did all this start? Like, did you grow up passionate about severe weather, or were you more interested in photography and cinematography and came in that way?
Well, it's a lot of things happen. As I always tell people, I didn't plan to be a storm chaser. There were really no storm chasers when I started, a few scientific guys. So storm chasing, I found it. It didn't find me like a lot of people nowadays. But I always had an adventurous spirit. That was probably the most important driving force when I was young. And I fused that with photojournalism and went out at night here and shot lightning, and one thing led to another. Then it was tornadoes and hurricanes, and before I knew it, it was a full-time occupation.
Yeah, so it sounds like it just kind of grew as you got outdoors and pursued this and got into more and more extreme weather. But
yep.
Warren, is there any one event that really surprised you? You know, you've experienced so many different types of severe weather, extreme weather. What stands out to you as something that you absolutely didn't expect and you found yourself maybe in a situation that was surprising?
Well, most people would think it's tornadoes, but it's really not. The biggest events to me are hurricanes. Hurricanes always just amaze me, although I've been chasing them since Gilbert in like 88, I think was my first one. The amount of power, the amount of destruction to me with a hurricane is what I find. Of course, it's a tragedy, but it's also, as a journalist and someone who loves to study severe weather, I find them absolutely fascinating, and especially storm surge. Storm surge to me has always been my specialty as a journalist. It's just something about the power of it and the amount of energy generated that you can't do anything about it. You can't unless you're somewhere safe. It's not like a tornado where you can suddenly go underground. With the storm surge, it's completely overwhelming, and unless you have a place to survive, you're going to be in a lot of trouble.
Warren, how do you document surge? You were explaining to me in April about how you documented Hurricane Ian last year. I mean, what's your approach? Like, what kind of places do you like to go for really documenting this?
Well, I try to find a structure, of course. I spend days surveying the area, kind of looking at the engineering of how things are set up and which areas are going to be exposed to direct wave action and which areas may be a little bit sheltered. You may have buildings that'll block some of that surge. And that's what I did during Hurricane Ian. I ended up staying in a parking garage to the south of Fort Myers Beach, and spent a lot of time in the surge, which we can talk about later, something I'm going to cut back on because of some recent developments in storm safety that I found out about. But that's my thing. I love to be in that surge to see what it does. There's a lot of things that I see as a journalist that no one else would experience unless you were actually there in it and saw how a surge develops and how it progresses and what happens during that period. You know, I've been lucky to see going back to Katrina and going back to Andrew, what a surge does. So I think my firsthand experience of surviving those events is really helpful in being able to convey to people what they need to do to stay alive when that kind of surge hits.
Yeah, Warren, with video and photo, I mean, how do you try to document this? Do you do time lapses? Do you do before and after photography? Do you just try to have video rolling? I mean, how do you, from a cinematography and photography approach, how do you approach documenting a big storm surge?
Well, all my cameras are waterproof. I'm waterproof to a certain point, not 100%. I do wear an inflatable vest, and I do need to go out usually into the surge. It's somewhat difficult to be in a building and be able to get all the angles. So I usually try to limit it to waist deep surge. Unfortunately, with Ian, there was a couple times when it got up to my neck and the vest kicked in and kept me out of it. But usually I try to stay out of any area where there's a lot of debris. If there's debris flying through the air, obviously you're going to have to be in more of a sheltered position. If it's just the surge, then it's a little bit different way to photograph it. But my goal is to photograph it and film it live. I don't do time lapse. I'm using remote cameras now too. And again, being able to show people this and showing them what happens in an actual surge, I think is really important.
No, it really is. You know, a lot of people think of hurricanes as palm trees blowing in the wind because that's what they see in the media, right? It's not that many people have gotten into a surge zone and really documented it. So I think what you're showing people is the most destructive part of a hurricane that many of them have never seen before.
Yeah, you have to see it. It's like any other major event, whether it's a wildfire or a tornado. People nowadays, because of social media, they have to see things in order to take action. And it's been proven that if they see a tornado, they're going to take action. If they're just hearing someone talk about it, or there's a warning, they're not always going to take action. I think it's the same thing with a storm surge. When I show someone a clip from, say, Katrina, where the whole side of a building's gone from a floating barge that broke loose, they'll say, wow, yeah, maybe I should leave next time, because that's the weirdest thing I've ever heard of happening. And again, with a surge, anything's possible. You just can't really underestimate the power.
Warren, I'm a little bit curious. Have you ever been in situations where you can see people maybe in houses and buildings that are maybe in harm's way? I mean, and if so, how do you handle that?
Yeah, when I was driving the day before Ian hit Fort Myers Beach, I was driving up and down the street and bars, and I was thinking to myself, yeah, I kind of knew what was going to happen there. I just a gut feeling. And I almost wanted to say something like, man, you people need to get out of here. This is ground zero. I'm not even going to stay here. Although I would have if I could have found the place, but that was ground zero. So you see these people and you think to yourself, man, you know, what can you tell them? What can you do to get them out of there? And I've learned over the years, you really can't. People that are set on staying are really hard to motivate to leave.
Sure. Warren, I wanted to ask you one more thing. A lot of times on the news, we'll see people in floodwater. Either they're trapped there by accident, or they're even choosing to walk around and sightsee in floodwater. What are some of those dangers? You know, we hear about some of the contaminants, pollutants, or even some health problems that can happen from people being exposed to floodwater.
Well, when I said earlier, I was probably going to spend less time in the surge, and the big reason is because of Vibrio. Vibrio is a bacteria. It's called a flesh-eating bacteria. During Hurricane Ian, there were in Lee County, which is Fort Myers Beach, there were 28 cases and 6 people died of this. That's amazing when you think about it. You would think, oh, people drowned, people got hit by debris, but bacteria, really? It's a very dangerous bacteria, especially when you get it in a cut. If you get an open cut, it gets in there, you can lose your arm. It's fast acting. It's 48 hours, you could be in intensive care. It's a very, very dangerous organism. It's going up because the temperature, the water, the sea surface temperatures are going up in the Gulf and even along the East Coast. And it's something you've really got to pay attention to. And if you're sending a news crew out, don't send anybody out who has open cuts or surgery or just had piercings or anything that can expose yourself to that bacteria. It's something that I think we're going to have to start talking more about in the pre-hurricane talk discussion when it's out there about you don't want to do that. If you get cuts, you've got to be very careful. You're sending news crews out. They've got to have the right protection so they don't end up stepping on nails or getting cuts. And again, I wouldn't be alarmist, but again, 6 deaths from that alone, just in that one area, is really frightening.
Yeah, Warren, that's probably something also for first responders to keep in mind too, right? Someone may have a little cut on their leg or their arm and not even think about it. You're saying if you have an open cut, you just need a small opening in your skin, and you can have some big health problems if you're exposed to floodwater.
Yeah, my understanding is that one volunteer from Florida went back home and ended up passing away. Probably just thought, oh, I've got a rash or something. But anytime after a hurricane, if you start noticing, the typical infection things are swollen, it hurts. It feels warm. It doesn't look right, gets all the redness. You need to get help right away, because the sooner they can get to that and treat it, the better chance you're going to have of surviving and maybe not losing a limb or going through a lot of extensive surgery to fix it.
Warren, this makes me wonder, what kind of first aid do you take in the field? I mean, you're in dangerous situations. It sounds like you're very well planned. You've thought this stuff out. Do you take a little kit with you? What are some essentials that you have with you?
Yeah, I do. And I'm also a tactical EMT. So I'm always out there hoping I don't have to help someone. But for myself, I carry a lot of water. After I get out of that surge, I completely rinse everything off. Betadine, I keep that. If I get a cut or something, I want to flood that with that as soon as possible and get that cleaned out. You really, the big thing is you really want to clean any wounds you have. If you're an EMS, if you're a news person, even if you're just out there surviving the storm, you really want to avoid any kind of cut or any kind of pathway for that to get into. And again, it's not just the bacteria. You've got a lot of industrial type things, again, like the pesticides and even raw sewage during Hurricane Ian. That was something that I witnessed and something you definitely want to stay away from. So there's all kinds of, it's really a witch's brew out there when that surge, especially when it first comes in. You really want to stay out of it as much as possible.
Warren, I appreciate you sharing that. I think a lot of people aren't even thinking about contamination of water, and you're giving a good insight there that it's really a public health problem if you get exposed to that.
Absolutely.
Bill, do you have any questions?
Yeah, I like this thread here. There was that came front and center during Harvey. The local officials were emphasizing the hazards in the water, and they didn't talk about the flesh-eating bacteria, but they did have it was such an overwhelming flood. We had a tremendous amount of industrial waste and raw sewage getting in the water. Another point on like in Florida, where you have a landfall there, you have a skewed more towards us elderly folks in the population. That's another good point to get them to leave, because us all elderly folks have skin like brittle parchment. And I don't even remember bumping this, but I bled like a stuck pig the other day, and I have no idea how I did it. So just getting out of your house in the panic of a flood like that, you're bound to run into things and get cuts. So maybe we can milk this into another important pre-storm activity to start educating people that live in surge-prone areas.
Yeah, I would really like to see, just like there's a surge warning, I would like something included in that about the dangers that are in the water. I think that would, 6 people, that shouldn't happen.
Now we're the Weather Service, the Hurricane Center, and the rest of the Weather Service have been really starting to add more and more to the indirect fatalities, which is what I would call that. It's the post-storm hazards that get to people. We're losing as many or more people from the indirect activity. So you're right. I'll certainly push this forward. A little bit of a change of gears. You mentioned Katrina. Where did you post yourself for Katrina?
Well, originally I was in Biloxi, decided to go explore up the coast back up towards Mobile. Was turning around and they turned the contraflow back. I couldn't get back. I would have preferred as a journalist to have been in Biloxi. I was in Biloxi that morning and saw some crazy stuff, but we ended up staying in Mobile, which I believe had Mobile Bay. I think we had a 15-foot storm surge and high. So it ended up being, for me as a photographer and as a journalist, a good chase, but nothing like that morning when I got to Biloxi and saw the damage there, which was just mind blowing.
Yeah, That woke me up to another question there. Have you ever been prohibited from entering an area to do your work by local officials?
Sometimes, but being the old newspaper journalist when I started out, I always find another way to get in. It's pretty rare nowadays because they also know I have credentials for being an EMT. And there's been situations where I've been one of the few medical people with any kind of emergency medical training in a location. Sometimes the fire departments will leave, and that's kind of a weird feeling to be there and under those circumstances. But generally not. It just depends on the situation.
Yeah. I don't fault them for leaving. I remember doing a briefing for Pascagoula in the run up to Katrina, and I asked they were wondering about evacuating their command center there. I said, "What's your elevation?" They said 9 feet. They can't stay there. They're of no use to anybody if 15 to 20 feet of water overwhelms their command station. So that's probably why you see some places where they know better, so they're gone. You're right. The people that are left are the ones that'll, no matter what you say, aren't going to go. Do you do any international work like our friend Josh Morgerman likes to do?
No, I leave that to Josh. International chasing is he said before when we've seen him speak is logistically very difficult. You're going to go that distance. Hurricanes or typhoons, whatever you're chasing, other parts of the world are very fickle. A lot of people went to Guam recently, and it just went through eyewall replacement right before it got to Guam. I forget which hurricane or which typhoon that was, but all the guys that went out there were probably disappointed. It was good for Guam. So no, I don't do that. It's very difficult to time that, very time consuming, and also very expensive once you get outside the U.S.
Yeah, I think you're smart. I wouldn't even consider doing that.
Guys, we have a question from online. Could I ask that, Bill, and then I'll shoot it back to you. A question from Casper Gregory. Does this flesh-eating bacteria exist in all areas along surge-prone zones? Are there places where this issue is more prominent than others?
It's more prominent in areas, the Gulf, of course. The Gulf is where it began. Now, like I said before, it's working up the East Coast. It's more prone in areas where you have salt water. It's a saltwater bacteria. It loves inland areas that are cut off. It loves swampy areas, those type of areas. That's where it really, the brackish water, think of that. Those areas are the areas that it likes. As a matter of fact, I was reading one guy was fishing and got part of a shrimp stuck in his finger, the shell. And he ended up and he almost lost his arm. And I think he was in an inland bay somewhere. So yeah, anywhere along the Gulf, you've got to assume that it's there.
It sounds like especially bays, estuaries, sounds, places where you're mixing fresh and salt water and it's very hot water. That's the big concern, right? Yeah,
especially salt water. Anywhere you have that water that's not moving a lot, you kind of think of it as stagnating. That's where it loves to breed. And that's where you have to be careful. Not just hurricanes. I should point this out. This isn't just a hurricane. You hear more about it, I think, because people probably get more injuries. But I believe I wrote some notes down here. How many people in Florida? I think an average of 9 people a year in Florida die from it. From the and of course this is the same bacteria that people get like when they eat raw oysters. It's the same type. I think there's 12 different types of the bacteria strain, but 9 people a year in Florida, I believe that's the average, if I got my notes right, that die from this. So it's not just hurricanes. It's anytime you're in that kind of water in the Gulf, you got to be real careful. If you see something that looks infected, get help right away. That's the secret.
Guys, those are all the questions we had online right now. Bill, I'll shoot it back to you.
Yeah, we've got this gigantic bloom of sargassum this year. What impact does that have on what we've just been talking about?
From what I've been reading, the scientists say that's going to have a big impact because it bonds to that. And it also bonds to garbage like plastic bottles and any kind of garbage that may be mixed in there. So, instead of just floating around on its own in the ocean, willy-nilly, when it can cling on to something and travel in, that's a problem. And this is something people should probably do a little bit more research on their own. If you see that sargasso coming in, you want to be real careful not to go in it. I would keep the kids away from it, keep animals away from it. and try to avoid it. And I think this year, supposedly, it's supposed to be a pretty bad run of it. So that's something you really want to avoid. And there are other types of bacteria out there. The Vibrio is just one of them, but there's several others that are starting to kind of become a problem as the water's getting warmer.
Wow. Hal, you've been tracking the sargassum. What's the latest on that? I haven't heard anything recently.
It's really nice. AOML, the Atlantic Oceanographic and Meteorological Laboratory out of Miami, they do an experimental weekly forecast of inundation risk, and they've backed off a little bit. There is, I'd say, a moderate amount of sargassum in the Central Gulf, but right now the risk of inundation is low for the entire Gulf Coast, except for a small part of Western Florida near Appalachia Bay. This week they said there's a medium risk of inundation there, but they've backed it off a little bit. But it still seems like there's a lot of sargassum in the Caribbean. There was a record amount this spring, and so the concern is that coming up the Yucatan Channel and then maybe impacting the Gulf, or even more likely the Florida Keys over through South Florida.
Nice. It's always something, isn't it?
Yeah. Warren, last question. When you a major surge event just happened, you have all this footage. Who's contacting you for that? I mean, obviously media outlets would be very interested. Like, are insurance interested as well? Any people in the scientific community that are studying storm surge or coastal hazards?
Oh yeah, everybody. A lot of it I donate to, say, Weather Service. Over the years, I've always done that. Any type of government interest where it's public awareness. I always give it away to them. I don't charge anything. I have an agent, worldwide agent who sells it to educational or TV shows. You might see it. I saw some on Discovery the other day for a program, and I got to make a little bit of money back. I mean, most of what I do, it comes out of my own pocket, and it's nice to get a little bit of money back because this gets expensive. But yeah, I especially like it when it's used for public awareness. That I enjoy, and it sounds bad more than the money. I mean, if people get to see this, and if one person decides to leave a storm surge area because I saw my footage, that's great.
Yeah, I think people, again, they're thinking worst case scenario, they have some wind damage to their house, or there's a tree on their house. And from spending time in these big surge zones, people come back sometimes and there's just a slab. And in the worst cases, they're looking at a slab and someone says, oh, that isn't where your house was. Your house was in another place, right? I mean, it's like a lunar landscape, right? Everything's gone in some cases.
Oh yeah, I've drove through. I don't remember which hurricane it was, but Crystal Beach.
Ike. That was hurricane.
I was Ike. Thank you. And I barely got out of there. And again, it's one of these things. I knew what was going to happen there, and it happened. And I got the last ferry to get across to Galveston, but the water was already coming up to the bottom of the car. And you talk about being like, oh man, what am I going to do? Yeah, I saw a water tower in the distance, and I wondered if I could climb up that. I just got out of there, and we know parts of it was moonscape. So yeah, it's a storm is something you can't mess around with. And again, year after year, you have so many new people moving into these areas. I mean, the population numbers for new residents is the highest it's ever been. And these people have never seen this. They don't even know, surge. They think of it like a little tiny wave or something. And it's very difficult to relay that to people of the force.
And it's been 15 years now since Ike, and there is more properties on the Bolivar now than there was then.
Yep.
Still a sandbar. If you ever go there again, instead of trying to catch the last ferry, go back the other way and get up on High Island.
Yeah, that was a lesson learned. Won't do that again.
Of course, you got the snakes to contend with if you go up on High Island.
Snakes.
Lots of them. Water moccasins, rattlesnakes, all the good boys.
Oh yeah, I've seen those in the water.
Well, Warren, it's been a great chat. Hang around with us if you can, because we're going to do a couple of other things, talk with Greg, and then we'll wrap it up towards the end, and maybe some other questions will come up.
Sounds good. I really love talking about this, and hopefully it'll do some good.
Okay. Hal, why don't you do your GeoTrack, pop back to me, and I'll do a quick tropical update and then give it to Greg.
Well, that sounds great, everyone. Wow, such a valuable conversation there with Warren. I mean, not that many people have really been in storm surge, certainly to document it as well as he has. And again, like he was saying, the population has just exploded in our coastal areas. A lot of people don't even really understand what storm surge is. So really cool stuff. Well, we're talking a lot today about flooding. Warren was talking about massive storm surge floods. Greg's going to be talking about inland flooding. We've seen a lot of both of them over the past decade along the Gulf Coast and the Southeast Atlantic coast as well. And if you spent time in a flood zone, you've definitely seen flooded out cars. And so we focus so much on the buildings and the residences that are flooded, but you spend time in a flood zone, you see a lot of abandoned cars, like I saw last year in these pictures from Hurricane Ian. A statistic I just learned about with inland flooding is that during Hurricane Harvey in 2017, as many as 300,000 to 500,000 cars in Southeast Texas were lost. That's as many as 500,000 cars were flooded out. And so last week, I had the pleasure of meeting with Rahel Abraham in Houston. She's a chemical engineer, but she's also a Hurricane Harvey flood victim turned entrepreneur and innovator. She lost her car and her building, her residence was flooded in Hurricane Harvey. And she knew so many people that had flooded out cars. So she decided to do something about it. And she innovated something called ClimaGuard. So ClimaGuard is this waterproof bag. It's a very large, durable, waterproof bag that can zip around your car, can zip around artwork, pianos, anything that's too big to take with you when you evacuate. ClimaGuard can zip around, and it has anchors to keep that stuff from floating away. It's a product that she spent a couple years innovating, and now it's really taking off. A lot of people in flood-prone areas are interested in it. And one of the cool things about it, it's actually small enough to fit in your trunk. So you can have a ClimaGuard in your trunk. If you live in a flood-prone area, you can quickly zip up your vehicle so that you don't lose your vehicle in flooding. So really interesting innovation there. And the cost of ClimaGuard, typically around $400. That's cheaper than your deductible you're probably going to pay if your car gets flooded out. We recorded a podcast together. This is GeoTrek podcast number 73, from flood victim to innovator, Rahel Abraham and ClimaGuard. And the caption there, Hurricane Harvey flood victim Rahel Abraham innovated a large waterproof bag that zips around cars and other large valuable items like grand pianos. Her Houston-based product is now gaining widespread attention as it promises to make flood-prone communities around the world more resilient. You can go to their website there, climaguard.co. That's climaguard.co. And really see what they're doing. But again, we talked on the podcast about if you get a flooded out car, your insurance company might give you $8,000-9,000. Now, how are you going to replace what you had for maybe a check of $8,000-9,000? In a big flood like Harvey, a lot of the cars that are sold on used car lots are also flood damaged cars. And so something like ClimaGuard, it can just avoid this whole nightmare by just sealing your car basically and keeping it from flooding. So a really cool innovation. And lastly, with the GeoTrek podcast, we're constantly doing stories about extreme weather and natural disasters not covered by the mainstream media. So we really want to get into the physical processes behind extreme weather and natural disasters, what their impacts are in society, and then how we can mitigate those losses in products like ClimaGuard. So check out our podcast. We're also on a lot of social media channels as well. The podcast is on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, and wherever you listen to podcasts, it's now ranked as the #1 podcast for natural disasters, according to FeedSpot. So I think a timely topic this week as we talk about coastal flooding with Warren, and now we're going to, I think later in the show, be talking about inland flooding with Greg. So thanks for your attention, everyone. Always great to share here on the National Tropical Weather Conference Live.
Right. Well, thanks, Hal. I'm going to give everybody a quick shot of what I'm looking at in the tropics. It's gotten quiet again, but there's interesting stuff as always. Think. Share. Okay. The Hurricane Center has upgraded Adrian out in the Eastern Pacific to a hurricane. It's still going through some fairly rapid fluctuations in the intensity and structure of the convection around the center, but it is going to be a hurricane for the next several days before it runs out of gas in the waters of the North Pacific. The latest track. There we go. Never a threat to land on this trajectory. The big heat dome high pressure is helping to steer it on a steady west to west-northwest track, and it'll get into the place where most Pacific hurricanes die, where the cooler water and maybe some increased shear starts affecting it. Elsewhere, we've got the remnants of our storm, Cindy, not expected to do anything now, 0% chance, and there's only a 20% chance on the area out to the east there. And here's the satellite loop. Cindy somewhere in here. This is the other disturbed area. This is another area of disturbed weather. It's moving off of the Central American and Southern Mexican coast, maybe even part of the remnants of Brett ingested within that. It's expected to develop also and move away from land. The rest of the Atlantic looks pretty good. Looks like almost like what it's supposed to for this time of year. And the one of the reasons we think it's going to stay quiet is certainly in the main development region is the finally getting a surge of a Saharan air layer. It's already reaching close to the easternmost islands of the Caribbean and expected to overspread the Caribbean area through this weekend. So looks pretty quiet going on in the tropics for the foreseeable future, which for me is a week to 10 days. I don't go any farther than that in Fantasyland model stuff. But okay, our next guest is Greg Carbin. I've known Greg for quite a while. We used to coordinate over the hotlines when I was MIC in Houston, and he was in the hot seat up at the Storm Prediction Center. I guess it's been about a decade, hasn't it now, Greg, since you moved on to WPC, and but the bad weather never leaves you. That's what we focus on in our world, and heavy rain is that. And I grew up in Wilmington, Delaware, and I noticed there was a couple of places up in my neck of the woods that had close to 10 inches of rain over the last couple of days. So, Greg, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Bill. Thanks, everyone. It's an honor to be here this morning. I'm actually coming to you from a somewhat tropical Vermont this morning. I know, Bill, you have connections with New Hampshire. I have family up here. It's not a getaway vacation by any means. I've got aging parents, in-laws who have been trying to help through that process, helping my wife here over the past few weeks. And while it's a nice destination, it's not necessarily the most ideal situation. But in our new age, we can kind of get a lot of work done remote, and that's what I'm doing here this week and next. So it's been about 7 years at WPC, and over 35 years in the business of weather. And I was listening to Warren, and I'm thinking, toxic water, toxic bacteria in water, seaweed expansion on the Gulf Coast, incredible heat, smoke, bringing air quality down to very dangerous levels across the Midwest. You think there's a message in this somewhere? It's just like it seems like it's just an increase in these extremes, and that puts a lot of pressure on meteorologists. It's really interesting from the perspective that, some days you can't necessarily predict what the big weather story will be. My background is specialized in severe weather, tornadoes, hail, and wind, going to WPC with a focus on extreme precipitation and winter weather. But every once in a while, you get the kind of unexpected attention to something unrelated to those events, like the smoke, or even a few years ago, and it coming up again next year, the forecasts for the total eclipse. What's the, what are we looking at as far as, likelihood of cloudiness at locations where the eclipse will pass? So I'm just constantly fascinated by meteorology and constantly amazed at how many different aspects of weather affect our lives every day. And that's what keeps me going.
Hey, my target is Lampasas, Texas.
Yeah.
For the eclipse. So what's the weather going to be there?
You have a very good probability, as you've probably seen, that somebody's done the climatology as far as cloudiness goes. And the further southwest along that totality path, the higher the likelihood you'll not have to worry about clouds. You move northeast up into New England, there's a better than even chance you're going to be dealing with some cloudiness, especially in April. Yeah,
a big return flow day would be bad for me. You'd get the
Yeah.
The overhead stratus won't break up quick enough if you get one of those. And the other thing, if we're still in the El Nino thing, we'll have a big subtropical jet probability. So you might have a lot of high level moisture.
Yeah.
I've got a fallback though. I like to play golf at land passes, so I can go.
There you go.
I can't lose on this one, except it'll probably cost more at the hotel.
Yeah.
It's interesting about this remote work. I'm actually at our place in New Mexico, and part of that, everybody's accusing me of decamping Houston to get out of the heat, but it was a long planned trip. We've got mother-in-law who still refuses to move out of her house, and it's very rural, so we come up here fairly often now.
That's the same situation I'm in here. Yep.
Yeah. The latest, the new study that showed that updated the atlas on return rates of precipitation. Have you guys been incorporating some of the findings from that into how you do your QPF and excessive rain outlooks these days?
Yeah, so that's there was an article, if you didn't see it, just the other day regarding the increased frequency of extreme rainfall, and the fact that the current atlas that NOAA has available to it doesn't really account for climate change. It basically looks at historical events and then tries to extrapolate those events with respect to extreme rainfall. And there are error bars on that calculation. One thing we've seen in the last couple of years, so I was tracking annual precipitation, monthly precipitation over primarily the lower 48 states, trying to identify aerial coverage of extreme events, which are most often associated with tropical cyclones. But we've gone through a couple of years now where the extreme nature, the extensive heavy precipitation events have been fewer and farther between. Now, it only takes one or two tropical storms in a season to change that, but it's been an interesting couple of years here, about a year and a half now, where we have not seen the extreme precipitation coverage that we saw, say, earlier on a few years back, and is probably cyclic in nature. What we have seen recently are these events where the aerial coverage is very small, but the amount of precipitation is extremely high. So, April, I think, was Fort Lauderdale, just an incredible rainfall event there where you set up the atmospheric ingredients to support repeat very extreme precipitation rates, 3 to 5 inches an hour for a few hours, and all of a sudden you're talking 15 to 20 inches of rain, which just inundates just anywhere basically, except for maybe right along the immediate coast. So you saw the airport close there, and then we just had another event in Pensacola, I think recently, earlier in the month, with 15 inches of rain or so in a few hours. Very similar setup with back building convection. To answer your question with respect to understanding these events, what I find quite remarkable is that the numerical models are not too bad with respect to the physics equations being able to generate these amounts of rainfall. Now, they're not going to, there's no such thing as a perfect forecast, right? And when you're talking about these really small scale events, you're not likely to nail that with much lead time whatsoever. But the numerical models do seem to have the capability to produce these amounts of rain. They just don't necessarily put it at the right place or in the right time. So I think we have the beginning of a toolkit available to us that can better identify where we will, potentially see events that are, outside of observational evidence of the past. But we can begin to message perhaps, this is an environment that's extremely favorable later today or into tonight, similar to the way we do tornadoes. And that's kind of how we deal with these extreme rainfall events, very similar to the way SPC deals with tornado events. We're talking probabilistically. Here's the level of confidence we have that the rainfall you see today could exceed the flash flood guidance, which is essentially a rate of rain in which the underlying soil conditions can no longer handle it, and you're going to have runoff. There's a lot of work going on in trying to better understand climate change with respect to especially metropolitan stormwater runoff, trying to design systems that can handle stormwater runoff for the coming decades from events that, are what we would consider quite extreme rainfall rates anywhere from 2 to 6 inches in an hour. It really is a new world. There's a lot of work to be done, but we're doing it. We're working on these precipitation forecast challenges for the future.
Yeah, that resonates real well in the Houston, Galveston area. Yeah. The drainage engineering for the whole area is designed around the old 1965 return frequencies.
Right,
and,
right.
And just empirically, we've known for a couple of decades now that those are just not good. So, and the new data pointed out the so-called nuisance rains that caused the drainage system to become overwhelmed are now becoming a bigger and bigger problem. And getting added to that is the combination of subsidence and sea level rise due to warmer water.
Yeah.
The ability to drain places like Galveston Island and the immediate coastal communities on even a typical day that you wouldn't normally get that excited about has become important.
Yep. We recently had a really interesting meeting with some folks in Texas that are really focused on this challenge of trying to identify when the risk may increase with regard to stormwater runoff to the extent where you might be able to begin to close roadways so people aren't driving into vulnerable low-lying areas. And there's some promise there that we have there's definitely promise that we're beginning to develop some of the tools necessary to make these decisions in advance.
That's great. Has there been any real changes to the flash flood guidance you use since maybe 10, 15 years ago? I haven't really kept up with that.
Well, we should definitely follow up after this, because there is a new kind of a center focused on riverine flooding, and we have a national water model that now runs on the supercomputer, has 25 million stream points in it. There's an underlying numerical model grid for what they call the hydro fabric, which basically gives you some indication of the response in basins. I am not the expert on riverine flooding, but the National Water Center is spinning up their water prediction operations division. I believe Russ Barton is the director of that, and we should get him on and talk a little bit more about what they're doing with regard to understanding rapid runoff and then longer term flood issues with respect to different basins. It's definitely a complex problem. Unlike the tornado problem, it kind of, you don't really need antecedent underlying conditions to support tornado genesis. But with respect to runoff and damaging flooding, you kind of need to understand the underlying antecedent conditions in order to better predict flooding. And so it is a combination of hydrology and meteorology. I kind of come to that problem from the meteorology side, but really to get to the answers and better forecasts, you really need hydrologists and meteorologists working together. And that's what WPC has been doing over the last few years, working closely with the hydrologists now at the National Water Center, trying to understand how the water model behaves under different conditions. We still have a large amount of expertise at WPC with respect to the quantitative precipitation forecasts, and also understanding how those forecasts play into the relatively short-term rapid onset or flash flooding. But the Water Center is really developing out and improving on the science of hydrology, and it really takes both to get to this challenge.
That's real interesting. Thanks for the tip on the progress at the Water Center. I think that's been one of our biggest concerns in places here in South Texas, is this very small basins that cause most damage and deaths when they flood. It's just, they're on the scale of a few kilometers.
Right. We get a lot of concern sometimes from the National Weather Service river forecast centers. They're the ones that, they're basically looking at these basins with respect to flood potential. And there's a lot of sensitivity as to where the forecast maximum rainfall occurs with respect to basin. If it's in this basin, it may not be a problem. If it's in a neighboring basin, it could be a significant problem. So the location of these extremes is very, very sensitive. The output is sensitive to the location.
Yeah. Steering us back into the tropical cyclone mode. I was just in awe of the model forecasts, several models of the extreme amounts, as much as 2 days in advance of when the big rains occurred over Houston from a stalling Harvey. I think that made a difference. People really were aware of what was getting ready to happen there. It's just like everyone else, if they hadn't experienced before, it would caught them by surprise, maybe. What do you guys do different when you forecast the QPF that goes out in the products for in the advisories for the hurricane?
So we work real closely with the National Hurricane Center. WPC provides the rainfall statement associated with every tropical cyclone advisory. Again, there's decades of experience predicting rainfall, and everybody realizes it's not a perfect forecast. There's always going to be uncertainty associated with these forecasts. Pattern recognition, past storms and their behavior. We've recently started looking at the displacement, similar to what the Hurricane Center does with their track forecasts. We look at how does our forecast with respect to high-end rainfall verify, say 3 days out. If we're forecasting a 6-inch isohigh at an area of 6 inches or more of rainfall in the forecast, when we have the realization of the actual event and the observations from rain gauges, how does that 6-inch footprint essentially verify with respect to the forecast? And so we've found that, and it's no surprise, it makes complete sense, that our displacement error with respect to these high-end precipitation forecasts mirrors that of the track error in the hurricane forecast. And that's because we do adjust the QPF based on the latest track forecast from the National Hurricane Center. So we're working hand in hand, and it looks like our error displacement is very similar to track displacement. So the better we get at forecasting track, hopefully the better we get at forecasting QPF.
That is interesting. Is anybody exploring trying something similar to what's done with storm surge? Run multiple simulations to come up with an exceedance probability that could be overlaid, and that you want a deterministic answer, but here's the risk area that might be impacted.
Yes. So, and I know Warren was talking about surge and the forecast for surge, and there's been a lot of work done at the National Hurricane Center to better message the dangers from storm surge. Basically where we started this conversation from, we use the exceedance probability to better understand the unusual or rarity of an upcoming event, but we apply a probabilistic forecast to that. So if you go to our webpage, if you go to the precipitation forecast at the bottom of that map, there's a link to what we call the Extreme Precipitation Monitor. You can go into that precipitation monitor. You can look at 24-hour or 72-hour forecast amounts of rainfall, and then you can look at where those forecasts, how those forecasts would be realized in terms of the annual recurrence probability. So in other words, if you're forecasting precipitation in the ensemble mean, that is say a once in 100-year event or a 1% probability in any year, you can also look at the higher end rainfall amounts associated with that ensemble, which we know actually better handle tropical rainfall. In other words, the forecast is usually kind of a consensus of a variety of model data. When you're dealing with a tropical cyclone, you're usually dealing with the higher end, more efficient rainfall processes. So that interface on the web allows you to bump up the rainfall to the 90th percentile in the forecast, and then look at what the annual recurrence interval is for that rainfall. So, you know, are we talking a 1 in 25 year? Are we talking a 1 in a 50 year? And again, we got to be careful because we know the climate is changing and that those recurrence intervals are based on historical observations. But it does allow you better situational awareness to answer the question, how unusual is this rainfall forecast?
Yeah, that's interesting about the return frequencies is based only on the data set from the past. Maybe we should be updating those atlases on a more frequent basis. So even if there is change still coming down the road, it's a better estimate than one that's starting to get 20 years old.
Well, that work is being done. And so there is some ongoing research now to better apply these frequency distributions and account for a changing climate. Wow. And of course, every day we gather more data, right? So yeah, that work is being done by NOAA.
Interesting. Hal, jump in here. Looks like you have something on your mind.
Yeah, you know, we have another question here from Casper Gregory over in Florida. He asked, has the Rapid Refresh Forecast System, or the RRFS, data been used by the WPC? If so, how has it performed compared to the other rapid refresh models currently in use?
That's a great question, and there's an ongoing experiment that we have every warm season, every year, called the Flash Flood and Intense Rainfall experiment. We've got about, 20, 25 people on site, and they've been, obviously with the recent events with COVID, they've done this every year up until this year. They were remote the last couple of years. This week, they're doing a hybrid where some people are remote, some people are at WPC, and they're doing a detailed evaluation of high-resolution numerical model and ensemble forecast for precipitation. Like any model or ensemble system, you're going to have days in which it performs remarkably well in retrospect, and then you're going to have days where it doesn't perform well at all. And the key is, I think, having forecasters evaluate this information and understand, under what regimes or what environments do I want to rely on this this guidance and information, and do I know that there are certain regimes where it's not reliable. So again, I think what's really challenging to the forecaster is pulling signal from noise, looking at where the model is generating a high-end event, and then looking at what the atmosphere's current state is and trying to understand, make that diagnosis for what's the current state of the atmosphere, and why would this model be correct in this particular scenario, or why would it be incorrect? Should I buy into it or should I not? I will say, for a number of events we've seen this year so far, there have been some very remarkably good forecasts from some of the high-res ensemble guidance. But again, for every one of those successes, I bet you I can find at least two events where the model puts a footprint of a foot of rain in 12 hours or whatever, and you may not even have a drop. So we've got a real challenge there. We got to understand models are very dynamic, just like the atmosphere. Ensemble systems are incredibly powerful, but so is the human in trying to understand pattern and match the diagnosis to the current model output, and trying to better understand, is this a reliable forecast that I can message on, or is this something we have to be a little wary about? And I think for the most part, at the end of the day, forecasters are still relatively wary because there is no such thing as a perfect forecast from a numerical model.
Yeah, Greg, I also wanted to thank you for that detail. That really helps us understand the situation better. I also wanted to ask you about on-the-ground flood impacts in places that people may not picture tropical flood risk. Inland places of New England, the mid-Atlantic states. You're in Vermont. I think, was it Hurricane Irene back in 2011? There were enormous flood impacts. Is that something that is fairly expected in that part of the world, or a flood like that, did that take a lot of people off guard?
That was an incredibly devastating event for up here. Vermont also kind of set the bar, I think, as far as recovery. They had they had incredible infrastructure damage up here, and they were able to turn around and recover during the late part of the season, and even into the winter months. They had to deal with roads being washed out and infrastructure damage. What's interesting about Irene is that the antecedent conditions, we talked about that already, and how important antecedent conditions are, really set the stage for the disaster that they had here. They had well above normal precipitation through the summer into the fall, and then you set up with a very, very intense hurricane coming directly up into interior New England. You add to that the terrain, the influence of terrain and orographic lift of that moist tropical air. And you basically had, wouldn't necessarily call those extreme rainfall amounts, but they did have 6-7 inches of rain in about 6 or 7 hours. And you add the fact that it was incredibly moist, the soil was saturated, and then you put the fact that you got terrain, this is falling in the mountainous areas, and then that water just washes down. We see that also in places like Puerto Rico, where terrain plays a big factor in the ferocity or the magnitude of the flash flood event that occurs. Growing up here, I do remember MCS activity during the summer coming along and dumping 6-7 inches of rain over a very short period of time over a very focused area and washing out dirt roads. And it seems like, it does occur. I think Irene is a special case where it occurred over a much larger scale for the state and parts of New York. Yep.
Had 2011 been a relatively dry year in Vermont, or dry summer up to Irene, how would have the flood impacts, do you think, been different if you put Irene's rains on a drier soil?
I think that probably would have been slightly less impact than what they saw with the actual event. Still, the rainfall amounts were extreme with Irene, and they came in a very short period of time. And again, terrain will also play an influence on that. But there might have been, a few hours there where you could have absorbed some of that rainfall early. But basically, the soil here was saturated for Irene, so that it immediately started running off and immediately started causing issues. So, it's hard to say in hindsight. That's a really interesting question from the perspective of, post-event modeling. And again, that gets into the hydrology aspect of the science. And I think that's an area that could be looked at, looking at the antecedent conditions and how that affects the outcome.
I was actually still director when that occurred. I had a couple of points. Vermont invited me to come up and speak at their emergency management conference roughly a year later. And just like you said, it was just amazing how much had been restored. There were still some roads out. Another factor that played into the severity of the flooding is the excessive rain rates were moving from the bottom of the basin to the top. So you've already loaded the bottom of the basin with water, and you're putting new water coming down the basin from on the top, which creates a higher flood wave when it gets there. And I don't think a single person there talked about it would have been less if it had been drier. So I think they were focused correctly on the rain rate and amount combined being the excessive part there. The one question I had, do you find any differences in the skill of forecasting the rainfall on the Gulf Coast scenario of the core of the storm causing the heavy rain and monitoring the slow motion of that versus the rapid moving storms and the pre-rains and et cetera coming up into like New England?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, Bill. I mean, you look at, I can think of successes and failures, just like forecasts from the models. I think, Ida is a really good example of a success. I had the signal that Hurricane Ida was going to transition to extratropical as it moved up into the Ohio Valley and New York. And the forecasts, especially the short-term forecasts for the New York City metropolitan area, were exceptional in that case. But even 24, 48, 72 hours out, there was a very good signal that this system was bringing, well above normal moisture with it, and it was going to interact with a stalled front across parts of the Mid-Atlantic and Northeast, and that you're going to run into some real extreme rainfall with that. One of the better onshore forecasts and even after landfall forecasts I can think of is Hurricane Florence in the Carolinas. The rainfall amounts there were record rainfall. I mean, you're talking about we're you're always sort of second guessing yourself when you begin to forecast rainfall amounts that are state records and that maybe have not been experienced before. Harvey's a case where we kept worrying that we were going too high, and then the new forecast guidance would come in and we're like, no, we're not. This is looking really bad. So every case is different, right? You know this. Every event has these subtleties that sometimes you can see them and you can account for them, and other times it's hindsight, and you learn.
Yeah, good old Harvey. At my age, I forget a lot of short-term details, but 45.34 inches.
Yeah, you remember that.
Embedded in the head.
And I remember very well, we were chatting in real time with that one. Yeah.
I think I sent you the picture when the water was on the porch.
Right. Yeah.
So, well, thanks, Greg. Looks like we're coming up on the top of the hour. Hal, you want to wrap us up?
Yeah, thanks everyone. This was a great episode. I mean, I just love the conversations we had. Greg, thanks for sharing all those insights on inland flooding and really where we're at with the state of the science. Warren, man, I'm just blown away by how much amazing work you've done, especially documenting storm surges. I think that's one of the hardest hazards to document. And I'm excited to look into some of the work that you've done and see more of these pics and videos that you shot. Everyone, thanks so much for tuning in today. We love to bring you the latest science and have these discussions. We're trying to be very discussion oriented this year, just to have these great conversations. And like Casper Gregory did today, you can submit your questions live online to be part of this interactive episode. So everyone, thanks for tuning in to NTWC Live. We'll catch you next week when we'll be back at the same time in the same place.
All right.
Thanks,
want to make sure that we say hello to everybody. Thank you so much, Greg, and of course, Warren, for being here today. We want to also remind everyone that it's USAA, it's South Padre Island, Tourist Bureau and Convention Center, the Weather Company, and the Weather Boy that helped us make this possible. Join us again in a couple of weeks. We're going to take a little bit of a break next week since it's holiday time, and we'll be back with another great program for you.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of NTWC Live Hurricane Center Podcast. If you did, head over to Apple Podcasts and leave us a 5-star review. And join us next week. This is NTWC Live.